This is episode number 29, Finite versus Non-Finite Verbs. Now in the last video we discussed the subject of the sentence and we noted right at the end that the verb had to match the subject. And we then observed that sometimes there is more than one verb following the subject. So in this video I'd like to explore which verb the subject actually affects. The verb that has to match the subject is called the finite verb. The other verbs that follow are called the non-finite verbs. So let's take a look at how that works. And we'll do that by looking at these three sentences. She will do well in her exams. I have been waiting for hours. And he plays the piano very well. So the above three simple sentences all contain a verb phrase made of one or more verbs. These verb phrases are will do, verb phrase, have been waiting, that's a verb phrase, and plays, that's a verb phrase. And if we look up at the makeup of the verb phrase, we can say that will is an auxiliary verb and do is a lexical verb. Have been waiting, we have two auxiliary verbs, have been and the lexical verb waiting, and plays is a verb all by itself, so it's a lexical verb. And that's how these verb phrases are broken down. Okay, so let's have a look at these verb phrases in the sentences to see which one is the finite and which one is the non-finite verb, and therefore which one is actually responding to the subject and which ones don't. By doing so, we can label them finite, non-finite. So in the first sentence, both verbs in the phrases are in their most basic form, will and do. Now, from earlier investigation, we know that will does not change morphologically at all in response to the subject, but do does. So we say I will, you will, and she will. But when following she, do does change to become does. That is, I do, you do, she does. However, in this sentence, we don't say she will does well in her exams. That's not right. And that's because in this verb phrase, will is the finite verb and do is the non-finite verb. So let's write that down. I guess you could say that will is changing in its non-changing way in response to the subject, and it's doing that by representing no change, but do is not changing because it doesn't become does. All right, let's apply this once again to the second sentence. I have been waiting for hours. So in this one, as we noticed, that there were two auxiliary verbs. The first is have and the second is been. Now the first auxiliary verb is not has because it needs to match I, and it is I have and not I has. Been, on the other hand, does not match I. It is not I been, we say it is I am, so that the verb is not matching the subject at all. So have is matching the subject because it's I have. But if been were to be matching the subject, it would be I am, which would become I have am. So in this instance, have is the finite verb and been is a non-finite verb. But what about waiting? That also doesn't match the subject. It is in its ing form, therefore waiting is also not aiming to match the subject, but rather to perform an alternative function, which is one of aspect. It's telling us that the event is currently in process. So if been and waiting were to match the subject, it would sound like I have am wait with you. And as you know, that's not standard English at all. So in this sentence, therefore, we can say that have is the finite verb because it is changing to match the subject, and been and waiting are non-finite verbs because they don't change to match the subject. So let's write that one down too. All right, let's just take a look at one more example, and that is he plays the piano. So I included this example to show you that a lexical verb can also be a finite verb when there is no auxiliary verb, because it has to be that the first verb in a verb phrase is the finite verb, regardless of whether it's auxiliary or lexical. So plays with the S matches the third person he. I play, you play, he plays. So in this instance, plays is a finite verb and there is no non-finite verb. So I guess that's another way that we can categorize verbs, to say whether they are finite or non-finite. Now, other than this extension on previous information given on verbs as a word class, there's actually not a whole lot more new stuff to add when talking about verbs as a function. Sometimes when referring to the verb as a function, it is called the predicator and not the verb. We'll just get that paper. There it is there. Now this is because the verb is at the front of the predicate, and I introduced that to you in the last video. So sometimes people refer to it as the predicator when it's referred to in its function form, but I'm going to call it the verb throughout this series, whether I'm referring to it as a word class or a function. Now we can also divide verbs up into transitive verbs and intransitive verbs, which is another specification that we'll explore after we take a look at the direct object. Other than that, however, verbs are verbs. So if you'd like to review what we do about the verbs again, or what we know already, then they're covered in videos 11, 12, 13, 14 and 15 earlier in this series. I, however, am going to push on to the direct object. So, until then, thanks for watching The Language Code.